Tiny drops of water make a mighty ocean, but a myriad of communities is what makes a united Sri Lanka. A very good evening to all our viewers and welcome. This is The Lost and Forgotten on TV1. Today's topic of discussion will revolve around the Bharatha community of Sri Lanka and its people who have been inhabiting this land for several years. Joining me in the studios this evening to discuss about the Bharatha community is Dr. Zamir Karim from the University of Colombo. Good evening to you, Zamir. Welcome to the show.
Very good evening, Hassan, and thank you for inviting me.
Zamir, let's start off by talking about the arrivals of the Bharathas. Now, it is said that the Bharathas originated from South India. How far is this statement correct? Do you agree with it?
Okay, so when it comes to the Bharatha community, the Bharathas have engaged in fishing as well as in pearl fishery, conch shell collecting, salt production for several centuries. Since time immemorial, the Bharatha community has been involved in various professions, especially to do with maritime trade and various others. So talking about their origins, there are various theories to how the Bharatha community originated. So the Bharathas at present identify themselves as Dravidians. There are various theories from where these Bharathas came to our country. So one theory is that the Bharathas originated in the Indus Valley civilization, that is the Mohenjo-daro Harappa civilization, and they were originally there and then they later moved southwards. That is one theory. Another theory is that they lived in Ayodhya as well as they were engaged in fishing in the Yamuna River. So they lived on the basins of Yamuna River. And then they later moved, this was before the period of Mahabharata, okay, and then they moved southwards. That's a second theory. Likewise, there was a Sri Lankan Legislative Council member, he was an author, and he was a civil servant called Simon Chetty, and in his writings, this is in the 1840s, so he says that the Bharathas are in fact descendants of a Kuruva casteman, that is a person belonging to the basket weaving caste, had a clandestine affair with a lady belonging to the merchant caste, that is the Chetty caste, and their descendants are believed to be the Bharathas. Now there is another theory that the Bharathas are descendants of Varuna, god Varuna, who is the god of the seas and oceans. And likewise there is another theory which is based on the fact that Bharathas are descendants of a Brahmin who had married a Sudra woman, and the children they sired are believed to be the ancestors of the Bharathas, according to a person named Henry Thomas Colebrook, who was the president of the Royal Asiatic Society. He was an English-British Orientalist. So there are various theories on where they originated from.
As a historian, based on the historical evidence, which one is the most accurate?
The Bharathas are, based on their physiognomy, you could say they are of Dravidian stock. So it is believed that even the Dravidians had lived in the Indus Valley civilization before they moved southwards. Even Professor Paranavitana has mentioned about it. So they may have lived in the Indus Valley, and later, after the downfall of the civilization, these Dravidians could have moved southwards. Based on the book Historia Ecclesiastica, so which was published in 1735. So according to this book, the biblical Paveim is believed to have been the place where these Bharathas had lived. So biblical Pavel was the place from where King Solomon, who built the very first temple in Jerusalem, he got his gold from biblical Pavel, and the gold was used as ornamentation to adorn his temple. So it is believed that the Pauravas lived in those areas as well. In biblical Pavel is believed to have been the place where the Bharathas or the Pauravas had lived. Now this has been a theory which has also been supported by various others. Like Edgar Thurston has also mentioned that the Bharathas hail from this biblical Paveim. But according to historians, biblical Paveim is supposed to be somewhere in Arabia or southern Arabia, from where King Solomon got his gold. So there are various theories on how the community originated. But though we identify the community as Bharathas, the Bharathas come from the Tamil word Parava, right? So they are also...
What does the word Parava mean?
Okay, so there are various meanings to the word. So the most common understanding of a historian would be that the Tamil word Paravai, now Paravai you write Ra in Tamil in two forms. You have the Chinna Ra and the Periya Ra, right? So when you write it with a Sinna Ra, Paravai means sea or ocean. Okay, so dwellers of the ocean, that is what it means. So Paravai means ocean, and as they lived along the coast, mainly on the Coromandel coast, Cape Comorin, which is now Kanyakumari, and Thoothukudi, which is Thoothukudi now, as well as along the coast of present-day Kerala. So that's from Thiruvananthapuram and the entire coast, Gulf of Mannar, and those are the areas where the Bharathas had lived since time immemorial. And then after they had settled in the southern part of India, what happened was during the Pandyan period. Now Pandyan reign lasted from the 6th up until the 10th century, and then again there was another later Pandyan period, 13th, 14th centuries. So during those periods, the Bharathas are believed to have held important positions. They were minor royals, they were aristocrats, they're supposed to have been ferocious warriors, they were chieftains, they had their own military regiments, there was a Paravar Pade means the battalion or the troops of the Parava people. So they held important positions during the Pandyan kingdom, and they were rulers of vassal states. So they didn't have absolute control over the kingdoms, but they ruled states which were under the suzerainty of the Pandyans.
Let's talk about the arrival of the Bharatha community to Sri Lanka. Now, certain records suggest that the first arrivals of the Bharathas were recorded between the 12th and the 15th century. Do you agree with this statement, or is there any other historical evidence to suggest otherwise?
Okay, so what happened was, as they lived along the coast, and they were considered to be a fisher folk, so they were engaged in lowly professions like fishing and, engaged in conch shell harvesting, pearl, oysters and conch shells and various other, and salt production. So they were considered as part of the lower caste in India. So what happened was, during various Mughal invasions, so when the Mughals conquered parts of Tamil Nadu as well as Kerala and Andhra Pradesh and all those areas, Karnataka, what happened was those Parava people who had settled along the coast, and they were in control of the pearl fisheries and stuff. So some of them started moving to Sri Lanka and started settling along the eastern coast, as well along the coast of our country in the maritime provinces, especially in the littoral villages. Many of them settled in the Gulf of Mannar. So Thalai Mannar as well as the Mannar region was in fact the stronghold of the Bharatha people.
Did they engage in pearl fishing in Sri Lankan waters as well?
In pearl fishing, because pearl fishing was one of the biggest sources of income for the Bharathas. The Bharatha women are supposed to have worn their jewelry were made of pearls. And then what happened was, the Mughals wanted to take control over their trade, the trade of pearl. So they wanted to take control over the trade of pearls as well as the pearl harvesting and all those oysters and everything. So what happened was, the Bharathas required the help of the Portuguese in order to battle against the Mughals, because the Mughals, the Arabs, the Afghan invaders who moved southwards, they wanted to take control of the pearl industry. That is when the Bharathas went to Goa. They sent a contingent to Goa to meet the Viceroy of Goa and requested the aid of the Portuguese in order to oust these Mughals from these coastal hamlets. And the Portuguese requested them to convert to Catholicism.
So this was in Sri Lanka, as they continued to live?
This happened in India, in South India. So certain families, they moved to Goa being the ecclesiastical capital of Portuguese India back then. Many of them converted to Catholicism, and some of them later moved to Mannar, because Mannar was also a place where you found those pearl fisheries quite popular back then. And the Portuguese wanted to take control of it, and they were given the right to engage in pearl fishery, and they managed to stay away from the attacks of the Mughals.
Right. Certain Sri Lankan kings are said to have recruited the people of the Bharatha community into their armies and battalions. Is that statement correct?
It is correct, because King Parakarnabhahu VI of Kotte, there was a time when the Arab traders are believed to have settled along the western coast of our country, especially in the Puttalam area, and they had some sort of a conflict with the native tribes.
They are called the Mukwars, if I'm not mistaken.
The Mukwars is again it's a contentious topic, because the Mukwars were in favor of the Arab settlement on the eastern coast. On the episode that I spoke about the Afghan community, the Mukwars supported they provided refuge to the Afghans and the Turks who had come to our nation. So there is a bit of a confusion whether the Mukwars had some sort of a rife with the Arabs. But anyways, the Sri Lankan king wanted to get rid of these Arabs who had settled along the western coast of our country, and it isn't sure whether they had some sort of a rift with the Mukwars, but they did want to get rid of the Arabs because they were foreigners and they wanted to take part in trade. And that is when the Sri Lankan king Parakarnabhahu VI, this was in 1415, recruited these Bharathas in order to get rid of the Arabs from the western coast of our country, and the Bharathas were allowed to establish permanent settlements along the western coast, that is from Negombo, Chilau area all the way up until Mannar. All those the littoral villages, those fishing hamlets were occupied by the Bharathas because they were engaged in fishery and pearl fishing and harvesting conch shells and all that.
Zamir, it is said that the Bharathas arrived during the period of the British as well, and they were engaged in occupations in the Colombo port. Talk us through the lifestyle of the Bharathas during the British rule in the country.
Okay, so from the Portuguese period up until the British colonial period, the Bharathas continued to come to our country. So the Bharathas who came during the Portuguese period in 1537, that is when most of the Bharathas converted to Catholicism. And likewise in 1542, 1545, that period, because there were many Jesuit priests who came to our country. And there was Reverend Francis Xavier who came to our nation, and during that period there were many Bharathas who were referred to as Paravas back then who converted to Catholicism. So there were around 20,000, 30,000 Bharathas who converted. And because Bharathas were considered to be the lowly caste back then, so they were Tamil-speaking low caste fisher folk who lived in our country. So they were not really accepted by other Tamil-speaking communities of our nation because they belonged to various other castes that were considered to be of superior status, because there was this very clear stratification of society based on caste system back then. And later what happened when the Dutch took control over the maritime provinces of our country as well as certain parts of India, they established these cotton mills and various factories. And the Bharathas started working in these factories. And then from India they started moving to Ceylon again because the Dutch also established plantations and all these factories in our country. And then during the British colonial period, most of these Bharathas came from a place called Tuticorin, which is Thoothukudi. Present-day Thoothukudi in Tamil Nadu. So they came from this particular place and settled in our country. There were quite a few families who settled. They established various businesses. Now, as their ancestors were fisher folk who were engaged in fishing, they were involved in the dry fish import as well as clothes, textile industries. Many of them were into arak renting and all that back then. And many of them settled along the western coast of our country, mainly in Nigambo. So you can divide the Bharatha community into two: the Bharathas who settled in Nigambo as well as the Bharathas who settled in Colombo.
Right.
So in Colombo they mainly settled in the fort area, in Petta area, because they had all their businesses in Main Street, the first cross street, second cross streets. Those were the areas where they settled, established their businesses, and they prospered. They became a mercantile.
Yeah, but when were they recognized as a community?
Okay, so in Sri Lanka, they were not considered a separate community up until 2001. So prior to that, they were considered to be part of the Tamil-speaking community because they spoke Tamil. So Tamil is their language. Now in India, they are considered a caste, not an ethnic group.
Right.
But in Sri Lanka, we consider the Bharathas to be an ethnic group instead of being considered a caste. Now even today in India, for example, there was a person called K.R. Narayanan who became the president of India. So he was from the Parava caste. So the Paravas are believed to be of lowly caste in certain states of India. But in Sri Lanka, they are categorized under an ethnic group, and many of them prospered during the British colonial period because they were engaged in various businesses, and many of them established their businesses in Petta region as well as in Nigambo because they were the people who continued to practice Catholicism despite the fact that the Portuguese had left.
I think, Zamir, interestingly now, since you said that the Bharathas were considered to be Tamils, we know that Tamils often practice the religion of Hinduism. Is that the case with the Bharathas as well, or did they practice several other religions? You spoke about them practicing Catholicism as well.
Now, when the Mughals tried to conquer parts of Tamil Nadu, they requested the help of the Portuguese in order to get rid of these Mughal invasions, and to prevent future incursions and forays from the Arabs. They requested the help of the Portuguese. So what did the Portuguese do? The Portuguese said, okay, we would extend our support to you if you convert to Catholicism, as well as you should also give a share or sum of money when they engage in pearl fishery and stuff. And then the Portuguese were given control of the pearl trade in the Gulf of Mannar as well as along the Coromandel coast and various other parts of India. So during the 16th century, what happened, many of these Bharathas who settled in our country, especially on the western coast in Mannar, they converted to Catholicism because they requested the help of the Portuguese. So the Portuguese said that we would help you only if you convert, because originally the Bharathas were fisher folk. I don't know whether you have heard of this watercraft known as catamaran. So catamaran comes from the Tamil word kattamaram. So the Bharathas are believed to have used these watercrafts with multiple hulls. So katte is to tie, maram is wood. So kattamaram was in fact used by these Bharathas, such as there was Vellam and Thoni. These are all types of watercrafts that were used by the Bharatha community. And this has also been mentioned in the writings of various Jesuit priests who settled along the western coast. And they continue to practice Catholicism irrespective of the fact of whether the Dutch were ruling our country or the Portuguese or the British.
Interesting. Let's talk about the culture of the Bharathas as well. As we know, every community, as we have been discussing on this show as well, every community has their own unique way of practicing several rituals, their own clothing and cuisine as well. Would you be able to talk us through the cultural aspects of the Bharatha community in terms of their clothing and the food?
In terms of the Bharatha community, when they converted to Catholicism, what happened? They took up Catholic names. So when you talk about Bharathas, you will not find Bharathas bearing Tamil names. Like in India or in Kerala, you won't find. There were some Bharathas who converted to Islam as well, and they became the Lebbes in Kerala, and they later moved to Ceylon as well. So the Lebbe community is also believed to be of this Parava ancestry.
Of Bharatha origin.
Yeah, so they were originally Hindus who had converted to Islam during various periods of Mughal rule. And those who converted to Catholicism took up names such as the Portuguese names, because the Portuguese were the godparents. So Rodrigo, Paiva, Mota, Silva, Soiza, Souza, Paiva, Kunge, Cavallo, Roche, and these are like some of the most Gomes, for example. And Fernando is the most common surname among the Bharathas.
Is it unique to the Bharathas?
It's not unique to the Bharathas. You'll find Fernando common among the Low Country Sinhalese as well as among Portuguese workers as well. But for example, Reverend Emmanuel Fernando. Fernando is the most common name among the Bharathas, but the Bharathas number less than 2,000.
I think he is considered to be the first Bharatha bishop of Sri Lanka.
The bishop, and there were many others, like there were many others who settled in Negombo, because most of those churches and chapels, seminaries and nunneries and convents that were established by the British were managed by the Bharathas which were established by the Portuguese, were managed by the Bharathas when the Portuguese left our country. So all those Catholic churches in Negombo as well as some of the Catholic churches in Colombo are still patronized, run by these Bharathas, because most of the Bharathas prefer their children joining seminaries and nunneries and leading a life in the path of God. So most of them are staunchly Catholics. And talking about their clothing, especially during the British colonial period, they did wear the Western clothes, and they didn't have a specific distinctive garment, nothing else.
What was the attire they were wearing when they came to the country initially?
Okay, so during the Portuguese colonial period, the women are believed to have worn a lot of pearls. So because they were involved in pearl fishery and stuff, they wore earrings that were so heavy that it used to basically tear the earlobes, and that's how heavy those pearls were. So because they were involved in conch shell and pearl fishery and oyster harvesting and all that, they wore a lot of pearls. There is no mention of what else did they wear, but they did practice some of the Hindu traditions as well, because they still wear the Tali Kodi. Tali Kodi is like the Mangala Sutra which the South Indians wear, and even those who settled in Sri Lanka, the Bharathas, they wear the Tali, as well as they have various Tali, like just like how the Indians have the Tali, the main pendant. So likewise the Bharathas have it as well. In terms of the cuisine, even the cuisine has been influenced heavily by those Portuguese who settled in our country. Unlike their ancestors who were Hindus, the Bharathas of present day, as well as those who converted, they consume pork. So they, instead of using vinegar, they use a lot of toddy in preparation of their pork dishes as well. They have their own moju, pickle and various other delicacies. The difference is that because the Bharathas were fisher folk, they use a lot of dry fish. So a lot of dry fish, a lot of prawns, a lot of seafood is employed in their cuisine, and they have the profeji and various other sweets as well. They add a lot of cashew nuts, quite very similar to the Portuguese cuisine. And then with a bit of a Sri Lankan and Indian touch as well, and South Indian cuisine, they use a lot of dry fish and seafood, as I mentioned.
Zamir, on multiple occasions you rightly pointed out that the Bharatha community was involved in pearl fishing, and there were traders as well. Now I think that begs the question, did they involve in the export of Sri Lankan pearls?
They were involved in export of Sri Lankan pearls to those Indian Nawabs and Maharajas. So this was prior to the advent of the Portuguese. So when the Portuguese arrived, they traded with the Portuguese, and when the Dutch arrived in our country, they traded with the Dutch. And then later when the Dutch established factories and stuff, many of them joined. During the British colonial period, the Bharathas, because they were involved in trade, and now by the time the British had arrived, during the early years of the British colonial rule, the Paivas, the Roche, the Cavallos, the Motas, the Rodrigos, they established businesses in the Fort Petah area. So they became an affluent community, an influential community, and they became part of this upper stratum that was during the British colonial era. So then, from being a lowly caste, they became an important community, an indispensable community in our country.
I think that brings us to the next question. Has the Bharatha community produced personalities in any sphere in the country?
The Bharathas have in fact stamped their identity in almost every sphere. So when we talk about the Bharathas, earlier I mentioned about Reverend Emmanuel Fernando, so he became the first Bharatha bishop. Likewise, there were many others like Nicholas de Cruz. He was a philanthropist, he was an altruist, he was attached to Nigambo as well.
He was the first president of the Nigambo Bharatha Association.
There are Bharatha associations not just in Nigambo but also in Colombo. There is Bharatha association in Kotahena as well. So the de Cruz family have rendered great services in order to uplift not just the churches but also the Bharatha community in general. Likewise, the Paiva family, they established various businesses in the Fort region. Likewise, G.C. Roche, the family was involved in importing butter from Australia, so they were the first family that was involved, and they also had their
First family involved in importing butter to Sri Lanka.
butter from Australia specifically.
Right.
And there are many others from this Paiva family, and there was a man named Sir Donatus Victoria. And Sir Donatus Victoria was in fact knighted, and he was also a politician, member of the Legislative Council, and there was John Rodrigo, who served as mayor of Nigambo. Likewise, the Mothas established various factories, confectionery stores in our country. The Rodrigos, likewise, the Cavallios, Christian Gomez, they established chapel, Jesuit residences and all that. And there was this FX Pereira and Sons. Now they established their companies. Their stores were in Peta, in First Cross Street, and their son Chevalier Pereira was made Diwan Bahadur by the Viceroy of India. So many of them did involve in businesses. Some of them even became doctors, proctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, principals. Many of them ran those seminaries and nunneries and convents along the western coast of our country. And there is this lady who's believed to be a descendant of Sir Donatus Victoria. So Mano Paiva is in fact a designer of couture clothes in our country. So there are many Bharathas who have in fact established themselves in almost every field in Sri Lanka.
Based on statistics that have been released over the years, how do you see the Bharatha population in the country? Has it increased, decreased, or remained the same?
Okay, so what happened was when Sri Lanka gained independence in 1948 and when the Sinhala Only Act was passed, what happened, many of the Bharathas, they didn't move not because they didn't know Sinhalese, because the Bharatha community is one of the communities that became Sinhalized over the course of time. So those who live in Nigambo, the Bharathas, they converse in Sinhala. Most of them converse in Sinhala as well as in English. So many of them have in fact forgotten.
Just a brief interruption, did they have their own language as well?
No, they spoke Tamil. When they first came to our country, for many centuries they spoke Tamil. But what happened was during the British colonial period, they became an educated class. So then they started learning English as well as they did communicate in Sinhala and Tamil because they were engaged in various businesses. But those who lived in Sinhala majority areas managed to pick up the Sinhalese customs as well as the language as a result of acculturation and cultural assimilation. So they have become a Sinhalized community over the course of time, especially those who live in Nigambo, because when you go to various churches like St. Mary's Church and Lady of White Snows or St. Sylvester Church or St. Joseph's Churches, all those areas, many of them speak Sinhalese. And then when it comes to Colombo, those who live in Kotena or Kotanjene, they speak Tamil. But the difference is that the Tamil that is spoken by the Bharathas is very similar to the Tamil that is spoken in South India. So it's not like the Jaffna Tamil dialect or the dialect that you'll find in the northeastern parts of our country.
They have a unique dialect.
It's the South Indian way of speaking Tamil, and which some consider as Kocha Tamil. So instead of speaking the Sri Lankan northeastern part, the dialect, they have their own dialect, which is more like the...
Are they the only community who speaks the South Indian dialect of Tamil?
Plantation workers, the indentured labourers who were brought to our country during the British colonial period to work in the plantations in the estates, even they do speak Indian Tamil. Likewise, the Bharathas speak Indian Tamil. But many of them, because in Colombo you have Bharathas who live in Kotahena area, likewise you have Bharathas who live in various other places like Kalamutri and in Bamlapitia and Dalavatta and all those parts.
So are the Bharathas only in Colombo at present, or can they be found in other parts of the country as well?
Mainly in Colombo as well as in Nigambo. So in Colombo you have the places where you will find the churches. For example, St. Anthony's Church or St. Lucia's Church. When you go to Kotahena area, so most of these churches are Catholic churches. So wherever you find Catholic churches, you find the Bharatha community, especially in Colombo, right, as well as in Nigambo, because they are the ones who are involved in running these churches and seminaries and nunneries and stuff. So they devote themselves to the service of religion.
So what happened to the Bharatha community that settled on the eastern coast that was involved in pearl fishing? Have they died down?
No. What happened was eventually they started settling along the western coast of our country, mainly the Gulf of Mannar. And certain families lived in Jaffna, but later what happened during the period of Arya Chakravarti dynasty and Sankili II and various periods, they started moving southwards and started settling mainly in the Mana area. In terms of their population, they were recognized as a separate, as distinct community only in 2001. So prior to that, any of Sri Lanka's statistics or enumeration hasn't identified them as a separate community. So up until 2001, there might have been, according to records, there were around 2,200 Bharathas in our country. But as of the recent statistics which was carried out in 2012, there were only 1,688 Bharathas in our nation. So the Bharatha population has slumped, and I wouldn't say that
Why is it?
the population has decreased. It's because many of them have now become part of the Sinhala community as well as part of the Tamil community. So distinguishing them from the rest of the population is difficult. And also because of the fact that their surnames Kunge, Punge and Dabrera and Pereiras and Silvas and Sozas and Fernandos are very common surnames in our country. Pereiras and all that. So it's very difficult to distinguish them because their culture-wise, they're not really different to that of the rest of the population. So they have assimilated well into various other communities, and also because of intermarriages over the course of time, they have become inseparable from other communities of our country.
Zamir, speaking about the recognition of communities, we know that whenever statistics and census are carried out, several minority communities have been grouped as others. But fortunately enough, we see that the Bharatha community has been given some form of recognition. Why do you think, what made the Bharatha community special in Sri Lanka?
As I mentioned earlier, the recognition came only in 2001. So they requested the government to recognize them as at least a separate community under the whole umbrella term of other. Right? So when it comes to like the statistics prior to 2001, they were categorized under the Sinhala community or the Tamil community, because no one really knew that there was a community called the Bharathas. Because in India, what happens is the Bharathas come under the whole Tamil ethnic group. So if you consider as an ethnic group, they are Tamils. But in terms of their caste, they are Paravas. But in Sri Lanka, we consider Bharathas or the Paravas as an ethnic group. So they were categorized as an ethnic group in 2001. So in India and stuff, you have Lebbes, you have Bharathas who had converted to Islam and they settled in our country. And they became part of the coastal Moor community. But now we do not have a distinction between the Sri Lankan Moors and the coastal Moors. Because back then we had Ceylon Moors and Indian Moors. Indian Moors were the coastal Moors.
So this could be a reason as to why the Bharatha community is believed to have declined over the years, simply because they have blended with other communities. Would it be correct to say that?
It would be correct, because they did not have like a very distinct culture that they wanted to follow. Or yes, they ran all these churches and stuff, yes, but they never considered themselves a separate community back then. They did have their organizations and various associations were run by them. But because they spoke Tamil at home, there is a language attrition as well. Now know that the most of the Bharathas do not speak Tamil. Those who live in Nigambo and those who live in Bamlapitiya.
So what do they speak now?
Speak Sinhala and English. But those who live in Kotena or Kotanjene, they still speak Tamil. And they know those who live in Nigambo as well, they do know certain terms and stuff in Tamil, but most of them do communicate in Sinhala as well as in English. So because of the language attrition and because of the fact that back then the British categorized them as part of the Tamil community because they spoke Tamil language and their ancestors hailed from Prasande, Tamil Nadu, which was then part of the Madras Presidency, as well as from Trivandrum all the way down to Cape Comorin, and then from various Coromandel coast and all those areas. So those were part of South India. So the British identified them as Tamils and as Malabaris back then. So
Zamir, as always, I think before we wrap today's segment of The Lost and Forgotten, do you think that the Bharatha community is at a threat of becoming extinct?
When you consider various minority groups, they are all on the brink of extinction. When you consider the Sindhis or the Parsis and various other communities, including the Bharathas, because they number less than 2,000. So there is a need to preserve their heritage, culture, ethos, customs for posterity. So if necessary steps are being taken, if you raise awareness about these minority groups by organizing lectures or even TV programs as such, or anything that could make the Sri Lankan population know about such communities that continue to live in our country, whose ancestors and the community has rendered yeoman services to our nation.
Indeed, indeed. That is the objective of this exercise as well here on The Lost and Forgotten. That is to apprise the Sri Lankan community of various minorities that have lived in this country for several years. Thank you very much, Dr. Zamir, for sharing your thoughts on the Bharatha community of Sri Lanka. With that, we wrap tonight's edition of The Lost and Forgotten. Have yourselves a great week ahead. Take care, stay safe, and God bless.